From 1986 to 1991, South Korea experienced the nation's first ever serial killer, given the name the Korean Zodiac. And less than a decade after the last confirmed murder, director of the critically acclaimed film Parasite, Bong Joon-ho, created the most terrifying recounting of these events, referred to as one of the greatest true crime films ever made. Make sure to sit back and relax, because this is going to be a long one. Based on a true story is a very difficult thing to execute. Do you add extra details to make the real story more entertaining and cinematic? Do you leave details out? How much of the truth do you adapt into your work? Bong Joon-ho stated in a 2004 interview that most of the more gruesome details are taken directly from the official record. He was extremely meticulous and thorough in his research, interviewing investigators, detectives, and journalists who actually worked on the case, and then citizens who were living in the area through these horrifying times. He even said the person who influenced him the most was one of the main policemen who tried to catch the killer. However, he did make changes. And we will get into those more as we compare the real-life case to the film, but I find these alterations to be more calculated and effective. A lot of people will argue that the more accurate the better when it comes to films like these, so if that's your criteria, this movie might take too many creative liberties for you. But unlike a lot of based on a true story movies, this film relies on purpose rather than entertainment. And there are three key purposes that I think make this film one of the most unique takes on true crime. It uses dark humor to capture the absurdity of how law enforcement really handled this case. As we go through the actual investigation, you'll probably think to yourself, this is absolutely ridiculous. What could have been happening in the offices for these mistakes to happen? And this film plays on that with Bong Joon-ho's signature style, offering critique along with a new perspective. It focuses on the investigation in a completely new and realistic way. They aren't that macho genius detective that you see in every movie. They are extremely human. But we will get into this more later as we review the film. Even though it had been 8 years since the last murder when the film went into production, the case and the victims had started to fade away into obscurity. Now yes, this movie is triggering for those affected, but because this case was unsolved, these victims didn't get the justice that they deserved. So we can't just forget about them. The release of this movie reignited interest in the case that later became solved. Not directly because of this movie, but it's the classic, we have to learn about history or we are doomed to repeat it. And the real-life case is responsible for a lot of positive change in Korean investigation and set new precedents on how to deal with crimes like these. The film is showing these severe mistakes on a grand scale with accuracy and critiquing them, all in hopes that this never happens again. Memories of Murder does something that I've never seen in a true crime film. Bong Joon-ho made the movie with the intention that the killer would actually most likely see it. 9 years after the final confirmed murder is when this movie released, meaning in his mind, the killer was still on the loose and could potentially still be active. He's not only giving the perspective of what the detectives went through, but this is most likely what the killer must have thought was happening behind the scenes. That's why it's so absurd. And yes, you could argue that it could give the killer a false sense of gratification that he outsmarted the cops, but the intent is to make him feel guilty, to see what gruesome things he did and the effect that it had on a nation. The only way to get these monsters, besides punishment, is to make them experience and live with the person that they really are. And we will also talk about this later, but the last shot is the main detective staring at the camera. He's looking directly at the killer, confronting him with his own evil ways. Almost like he's saying, I know who you are, and I know what you've done. But in reality, he didn't know who it was. No one did. It's not like the Zodiac where the film is based on a theory and you end the movie with some sort of answer, because just like in real life, they might have had an idea, but the killer hadn't truly been identified. The main suspect in the film very closely resembles the main suspect found later in 2019, but by the time Bong Joon-ho finished the film, he didn't even know who he thought the killer from his own movie was. Some people hate ambiguity, but Memories of Murder uses it to its advantage and has you constantly second guessing, just like the detectives. It makes the film so much more powerful. It's the horrifying reality of the case. For the citizens of HWASEONG, South Korea, the killer could have still been amongst them. It could have been their neighbor, someone at their local grocery store, someone they walk past every day on the street. The killer could have been right next to them in the theater, watching the movie with you. Hwaseong is a rural city in the Gyeonggi province of South Korea with an estimated population of 160,000 citizens during the 1980s. It is home to the largest area of open farmland of any city in this province. Back then, there was nothing but hills and grass fields. There wasn't even a proper police station in the village where the first 5 murders occurred, making this an ideal place for a bloodthirsty murderer to get away with their crimes. But until September of 1986, this small town in Hwaseong seemed to have nothing to worry about. It was actually very common for women to walk home alone at night, according to residents in the area at the time. Everyone felt safe. On the 15th of September 1986, the first victim, Lee Won-eum, a 72-year-old woman, was walking home after visiting her daughter. It's not confirmed if she was attacked that night or earlier the next morning on the 16th, because she also seemed to have grabbed some cabbages on her walk, something she would have done in the morning. After being reported missing for 3 days, on the 19th, a man on his way to work found her dead body in a pasture nearby an agricultural road. Based on accounts, the very misguided overall societal belief was that elderly women could not be the victims of attacks or assault. 1, because of respect, and 2, this had never seemed to happen, especially in this village. With this notion, along with the fact that she was found by a road and her clothes were quote-unquote a mess, police initially thought that this was a hit-and-run accident. But after further investigation and an autopsy, it was revealed that there were signs of SA and the cause of death was strangulation, turning this into a murder case. Not only was the police presence and their resources already limited to begin with, this murder occurred during the most important national event at the time, the opening of the 1986 Asian Games in Seoul. Many surrounding police stations were sent there to help with security, leaving only 3 detectives for the murder case of Lee Won-eum. Very obviously, they were unable to track or pin any suspects. A little over a month later, the second victim, Park Hyun-suk, was found in a waterway canal. This time, the victim had been stabbed and strangled to death, and the killer had used her own clothes to tie her up. She had also been SA'd. There was, however, actual evidence near the crime scene that could possibly lead investigators somewhere: a cigarette butt and a milk carton. From here, reports get conflicted. Sources say police at the time were worried about the pressure that they would face, so the 2 murders weren't talked about in the media. And because there wasn't any reason to believe the cases were connected, even though now it kind of seems obvious, they weren't able to launch a full investigative workforce in the area. Yes, they were under-resourced, but this is where, like many true cases, police incompetency and outright mishandling of investigations led to more tragedy. In November of 1986, a woman, who I was unable to find information on her name and age, was attacked, assaulted, and robbed in a nearby field late at night. The attacker had her at knife point and demanded she give him all her money, but she had dropped her purse in the grass during the altercation. He left her there since she was tied up and went to go look for it, giving the woman an opportunity to escape, running to the nearby town as she was luckily met by residents who rescued her. Her description of the man and event that she gave to police heavily resembled a description given by assault victims from 7 months prior, where multiple women were attacked but not murdered around the same area. The similar patterns of the attacker compared to the killer, along with the detailed description, now gave police a suspect to look for as dots started to be connected. These were all most likely done by the same person, but the police just still weren't sure. The suspect was in his mid-20s, specifically around 24 to 27. He was about 5 feet 4 inches to 5 feet 6 inches tall, with a slender build. His distinguished features were short black hair, sharp eyes, and a pointed nose. And all of the survivors noted that he had unusually soft hands. A facial composite was made, and the police started their investigation. Again, police incompetence, but it took until the 5th murder in January of 1987 for them to act as if all these killings were done by one person. The key reasoning being the locations of all of them were within 1.2 miles of each other, and then of course the similarities in each case. It simply should not have taken that long. But now a full-fledged investigation was launched, including police from the surrounding cities in the province, and even some coming in from Seoul, the largest and most populated city in South Korea. They started with a full forensic investigation of each crime scene and all the existing evidence. They didn't have the ability to do DNA testing in the country, so the only physical evidence they could use to match to a suspect was the blood type B. The amount of help actually became overbearing to the case, and with limited technology, the methods became very analog. They started testing the blood and hair of all the men in the city, and were comparing fingerprints of everybody just by looking at them. The public was getting more hysterical by the day, and the fear kept spreading. The pressure for law enforcement to come up with some sort of answer was at an all-time high. By September of 1988, police had nothing new to go off of. They knew the killer's MO, using the victim's clothing to bound and strangle them, and there's some more details on what he did to them that you can look up at your own discretion, but I won't be discussing them here because, frankly, it somehow gets even worse. What we have gone over already is absolutely horrible, but this man was a depraved psychopathic freak. They knew that he went after women, majority of them being young. On 2 occasions, it had been on a rainy night, and 3 of the victims were wearing red clothing. On the surface, that seems inconsequential, but rumors started circulating that all of the victims were wearing red, and it only happened on rainy nights. So female police officers started dressing up in red and waiting out on rainy nights to hopefully catch the killer. There was even a reported sighting of the killer where a man with long hair came face to face with him before the killer ran away, and his description was an exact match. But still, they had nothing. Public outcry kept growing stronger, and the country was going through its own uprising as mass protest against police brutality filled the streets of South Korea. To somehow win over the public opinion, the police needed something to ease the people. The 8th murder is where everything completely fell apart for detectives. On September 16, 1988, Park Sang-hee, a 14-year-old middle school girl, was attacked and murdered inside her bedroom. The killer was no longer just stalking his victims out in the open fields at night, but now he was breaking into their homes. Everyone already felt unsafe being outside, but now the comfort of your own home was lost. Because of the severity and the fact that the methods were different, they treated this as a singular case separate from the rest of the murders. This was also an attempt to try and ease public concern, but it was far too late. At this point, all we have seen is incompetence, mistakes from the start, leniency, and unpreparedness. The people of HWASEONG and all of South Korea were rightfully livid at law enforcement. Hair strands and other evidence left at the crime scene determined that this killer had the blood type B, same as the 7 prior cases, and there were traces of metal found in the hair. Now, while 24% of South Korean citizens have B-positive blood, it still baffles me that they could somehow make an argument that this was an individual case amongst all that's happened in the last 2 years. But at the very least, they did have more to go off of, testing every man in HWASEONG between the ages of 20 and 30 working with machinery, looking for individuals with the same blood type. Whoever matched that description, they started tracking their every move. Yoon Sung Yeo was a 22-year-old man who did fit some of the characteristics, but so did a lot of people in that area. He had developed polio earlier in his life and now walked with a limp, and was said to seem to be somewhat of an outsider and a little intellectually off. But this was also due to police forcing the public to think that he was the murderer, saying that his polio created an anger in him that in turn was taken out on women, overall creating an exaggerated persona for him. And the first thing that stood out to me was the story given by a worker who came face to face with the killer. He said that he sprinted away from him. How can you do that with a limp? As I'm sure you can guess, Yoon Sung was not the killer. But after being tracked for months, in July of 1989, he was brought in for questioning. After being beaten, tortured, food and sleep deprived, and brutally interrogated, the police coerced him into giving a forced confession that he was the murderer of Park Sang-hee, even making a public press conference to televise his false confession. As the investigation continued and police tried anything to convince the public that he was the killer, inconsistencies started to become very apparent. See, in the 1980s in South Korea, Because of the limited technological advancements when it came to evidence, police would rely solely on confession to prove someone was guilty of a crime. This, along with the fact that the pressure on police was at an all-time high, they could have chosen anyone to quote-unquote be the killer. Yoon was just severely unlucky. They took him to the house where the girl was murdered, and there was a tall brick wall surrounding it that you would have to climb in order to break in. He was simply physically unable to do that. They also faked evidence like matching footprints and deprived him of a public defender in court. It was all around an absolute terrible mishandling of justice and police brutality on someone who had already gone through multiple tragedies in their life. But law enforcement was dead set on framing Yoon Sung-yeol as the killer. He was sentenced to life in prison. But then, in 1990, murders continued. On November 15, 1990 and April 3, 1991, two more murders occurred of a 14-year-old girl and a 69-year-old woman. The methods were the exact same, and now all the murders committed were all within a 6-mile radius. And the more I have researched this case, the more pissed I become at police. For one, they determined that Yoon was a copycat killer and was still guilty. But them spending all their time on the wrong person allowed the real monster to not only get off scot-free, but continue his streak of killings. For 5 years, a killer took the lives of 10 innocent victims, using some of the most brutal and disgusting methods. But after April of 1991, the killings just stopped. The police practically wiped their hands clean of any responsibility and went, oh well, I guess this just solved itself. From the beginning, law enforcement was more than inadequate when dealing with this case. What started as unpreparedness and, frankly, stupidity led to brutality. The city of HWASEONG and the entire country of South Korea lived in constant fear, and anger developed from years of police either not doing their job or doing it maliciously. And it all turned into a public outcry that has since been referred to as one of the most severe mistakes in Korean investigation history. The trust was lost. Since then, they have done a complete 180, and this case has set a new precedent for all investigations. And with advancements in DNA research and technology, now South Korean police solve over 90% of homicide cases. As the killings stopped, people started going back to their regular lives, and the victims faded into a terrible history that everyone seemed to want to forget about, especially law enforcement. That was until 2003, when an up-and-coming South Korean director became fascinated with this case that he lived through, seeing the nation's fear firsthand. And that real-life terror bled into his work as he created the most terrifying recounting of a true crime case that we have ever seen. Bong Joon-ho originally found inspiration for this film from a play about the crimes called Come to See Me from 1996, where he got a few of the changes that he included into his film. Just like his own movie, this play had reminded him of the actual case as he started researching it for the next 6 years, when he finally began production of Memories of Murder. The sites they filmed at were all within a 3-hour drive of the murder locations and look almost identical to what HWASEONG in the 1980s and 90s looked like, giving the movie an extra sense of realism. The scenic backgrounds paired with the gruesome events that took place also give a great representation of how brutal this was compared to how quaint the village and the people were at the time. This truly ruined HWASEONG, and someone took advantage of such an innocent and beautiful place and victims. Adding to the accuracy and brutality, the opening scene is a recreation of police finding the body of the second victim, Park Yeon-suk, in a farm waterway canal, also occurring on October 23, 1986. But this is used as the first killing out of only 6 that they portray compared to the 10 plus from the real-life case. We are then introduced to our main character, Detective Park Do-man, who is played by one of the most underrated actors of the 21st century, Song Kang-ho, also known as Mr. Kim in Parasite. He is the lead on the case, and just like HWASEONG law enforcement, is extremely unprepared for what is to come. He relies on intuition. 1, because of the lack of resources, but 2, he kinda seems arrogant. Not in a mean-spirited way, but with the size of the village and the fact that nothing like this has ever happened here before, he feels like this will be an open and shut case. There's this scene in the beginning that only lasts about a minute, but I feel like it captures his perspective while tasking you with the same job perfectly. After the second body is found and Detective Park is starting to collect evidence and suspects, 2 young men are brought into the station. One was assaulting the sister of the other, and the brother came in and stopped him, beating him up along the way. His colleague tells him this story, and then gives him a simple question. Which one is the assaulter? No evidence, no DNA, no talking to either, just the simple facts of the event along with two suspects. Each of them have cuts and bruises on their face, both fit the description of the other, both look similar with black medium length hair and a thin mustache, but one looks more smug with a tough guy look on his face, and the other looks kinda nervous and skittish. You can make equal arguments for both of them being the assaulter and the brother. The guy on the right could be nervous that he's about to go to jail for assaulting the girl, or because of the shock of what just happened to his sister. The guy on the left could be smug because he's a terrible person who feels like he's going to get away with what he just did, or he is proud of defending his sister and winning the fight. And based off what we normally think a creep and a protective brother looks like, you probably answer the guy on the right. But when you first see them, the guy on the left shows signs of nervousness too, and he has more marks on his face as if he lost that fight. It really could be either. A complete coin flip. It's showing you that you can't rely on intuition, but more importantly, this is a condensed way of how it could have felt to be investigators. You have your theories, but you need concrete evidence. You want to solve it, but you're constantly second-guessing yourself. And this is precisely the journey that Detective Park goes on throughout the entire film. Comparing the actual case to the movie some more, the hectic nature of the offices and crime scenes, the quickness in which everything started happening, the incompetence of Detective Park and his partner, the pressure from the media, and then the fear of everyone in the town, is extremely accurate. This really feels like what they must have been going through. Absolute madness and constant anxiety. This movie is meant to be really uncomfortable. Instead of adding the thousands of officers like they did in real life, even though it feels equally claustrophobic, they bring in one detective from Seoul, Seo Tae-yoon. And while Seoul officers didn't work directly with HWASEONG law enforcement, Bong Joon-ho made them work side by side to add the more calculated side of the investigation, as opposed to Park's more analog and inexperienced way of handling things. This also gives us 3 detectives, just like the investigation of the first 5 murders. Just like the majority of crime films, Memories of Murder does focus on the perspective of the detectives, but not in a generic archetypical way as most do. The detectives in this movie don't represent actual people. Rather, they serve as a time capsule for what Korean investigation and the overall social climate were like in the mid-1980s and 1990s. I came to feel that the general social political situation of that time was as much to blame as any individual, Joon-ho says in an interview. While the 2 main investigators we see in the film have very different methods, they each have the same motivation: catching the killer. But together they exhibit all the factors that the actual cops dealt with: unpreparedness and a lack of resources. The nation had never dealt with a serial killer before, and as much as they did things wrong, I feel as if this film allows you to sympathize with their situation to an extent. But then we also have the dark side of what the pressure to save the town brings: brutality. Detective Park is quick to pin anyone as a suspect. Any glimpse of guiltiness and he jumps right on, ready to lock away the killer. And this comes from a good place, but the passion can easily turn into malice, bringing us Kwang-ho. He is supposed to represent Yoon Sung-yeo, the man wrongfully convicted of the HWASEONG murders. Kwang-ho is a very exaggerated version of Yoon. He is slightly more suspicious due to him being around the crime scenes and following one of the eventual victims, but he is genuinely intellectually disabled. Yoon was just physically disabled and not the brightest guy. But in both cases, there is no way that they could have been the killer for many obvious reasons. But they each get the same treatment. He gets locked up, interrogated, abused, and police relying on confession then coerce him into admitting to the murders. They also fake a footprint to try and plant evidence to prove he was the killer, and instead of a press conference, they bring Kwang-ho to one of the crime scenes and make him reenact a killing, all in hopes to convince the public that they had found the killer so they could ease their worries. But as more killings continue, unlike Yoon, they actually let Kwang-ho go. But this exact situation ends up happening again to another suspect. And at first it feels like it comes from a place of laziness, but very quickly you can tell this is desperation. Now from here, I don't want to recap and spoil the entire rest of the movie for you. I highly recommend you go watch it if you haven't already. But I do want to discuss some more of the similarities along with the differences in the real life case. And also, most importantly, the main suspect. They use the same MO for the killer, tying them up with their own clothes, assaulting, and then strangling the victims. But they have all the killings take place on rainy nights, and the victims all wear red. And if we remember, those were the rumors that circulated in HWASEONG, but only applied to a few of the actual murders. They also have the females dress up and wait out on rainy nights to try and catch him in the act, but to no avail. Even though it's for dramatic effect, I actually really like that they focused on this aspect and used it more prominently. I know I've said this 18 times now, but this movie is playing on perspective. Not just the cops and the killer, but also the people of HWASEONG. This calculated and methodical process the killer is taking in the movie represents how the townsfolk viewed him. It makes him less human and more of a mythical figure. We also see this with the story of the man in the outhouses by the school. In reality, the killer is just some twisted, sadistic creep, but to the townsfolk, he is this unstoppable monster hiding in the shadows. Before, there wasn't any real fear in this town, but that new widespread fear, the fear of the unknown, what lurks in the dark, what walks behind you at night, is now represented by a real being. Another big creative liberty taken was every night a killing happens, a song plays on the radio that is requested by an anonymous listener, most likely the killer. And this is mainly used to bring them to the final and most likely suspect. But the lore, the mystery, and now the song turn this movie into a borderline horror film. I mean, the only scenes that we see the killer in are absolutely terrifying. He jumps out of the bushes like a creature and walks with a victim in hand like a Michael Myers or Jason would. And I'm not trying to make light of it, but it is that terrifying. It feels like a monster-esque horror movie. And that's what it felt like to be in HWASEONG during this time. But all of these changes, while more exciting, are there to separate the movie and make it its own story, yes, but they also blur the line between reality and fantasy. The citizens of HWASEONG were quite literally living through a horror movie. This is all representative of their perspective of what happened. See, the film is not that far from the truth, and if you were to watch it without knowing the real case, you'd probably think it's terrifying and horrible, but it does feel like a movie. The second you find out it's not only based on a true story, but the true story is actually worse, that's when it becomes most effective. That's why I love that Bong Joon-ho reduced the number of murders to 6 instead of 10 to 14. The real case almost feels more movie-like, because it was that horrible. But this brings us to the main suspect, and what I consider one of the best endings of any movie that I've ever seen. After tracking who was sending the song request and also descriptions from a survivor of one of the attacks, Park and Seo pinned down this guy as their main suspect. Just like the real-life accounts and descriptions, he had black hair, was about the same height with very similar features, and was reported having unusually soft hands. They were convinced that he was the killer, and speaking from an audience perspective, when I first watched it, I was pretty convinced too. After a long struggle, they were able to get a sample of his DNA. They send it off to a lab in America to compare with DNA found at one of the crime scenes. And as they wait on the results, it all comes to a head after the murdering of a young schoolgirl, where they have their final confrontation. Seo, always being the more intelligent, calculated, and lawful detective of the two, has completely gone over the edge. His anger and desire to catch the criminal has turned him into how Park was in the beginning of the film, whereas the second half of the movie sees Park acting more rational, using some very smart detective skills and piecing clues together rather than using brute force. Again, the two of them are a combination of the real-life law enforcement. Yes, they have made mistakes along the way, but at their core, all they had was a pure desire to catch the criminal. Every method they could have possibly tried hadn't worked, but they thought they finally had an answer. And Seo is about to murder the suspect, but Park stops him. The results from America were in, and they were inconclusive. They didn't have nearly enough to prove that this was the killer, even though they were so sure. Detective Park then stares into his eyes to use his intuition he's always been so confident in. The same intuition that actually started working as his skills started to shine. He's trying to tell if deep down he knows this is the killer or not, as we stare into his eyes and do the same. And he just doesn't know. Bong Joon-ho, after all his research, didn't know. HWASEONG detectives didn't know. Hell, I didn't even know after the first 2 times I watched it. They have to let him go, and we end without knowing if that was truly the killer. In 2003, Park has created a new life for himself and his family as he returns back to HWASEONG 2 decades later. He stops by the canal where the first victim was discovered as he reflects on the case in his previous life as a detective. As he stares down the canal, a little girl walks up questioning what he's doing. She says it's weird because a while back she saw a different man doing the same thing, and when she asked him what he was doing, the man said he did something here a long time ago. We are led to believe that that was the killer. As Park's detective brain kicks back in, he asked her what he looked like, and she says he was plain, just ordinary. And this causes Park to have what seems to be a revelation, and many believe it's because he knows who the killer is, the main suspect from earlier, who was very normal looking. But I think he realizes something even more sinister. The killer is not only still out there and could be active, but it really could be anyone. Most people just look ordinary, and at face value, most killers look pretty normal. It's not until you find out their psychopathic ways when you start to look at them differently and they appear more evil. Some people have intuitions about people, but that's just not a strong enough basis to go off of when trying to determine who someone really is. The HWASEONG killer on the surface was just a normal guy, and that's what's most terrifying. To everyone's knowledge, he was still out there, but like I had said before, people started to forget as the killing stopped. Park seemed to move on just fine and forget too, but once he was reminded and the reality of the situation set in, he realized that the killer, along with subsequent future psychos, are still out there. Not lurking in the shadows, not hiding in the dark, but normal looking people that if you saw in public, you wouldn't even take a second look. It almost felt impossible to try and do this movie justice because I honestly believe it is one of the greatest films ever created. Yes, it makes changes and tries to be entertaining, but it takes no shortcuts when it comes to the purpose of what Bong Joon-ho was trying to achieve. That's why there's an ambiguous ending instead of a heroic final battle where the villain is stopped. That just wasn't the reality. The ending frame of Park staring directly at the camera can be interpreted in multiple ways. I do believe it is because he is looking at the killer. The movie was made with the intention that he would see it, and this was Joon-ho's way of confronting him. But I also believe that he is looking at South Korean law enforcement. The statute of limitations in Korea for these crimes was 2006, meaning if he wasn't found guilty by then, he would get away with all of this. It almost feels like a plea for the detectives to still try and find him. In a non-cliche way, even the title Memories of Murder is like, hey, don't forget about this. He's still out there. Remember what he did. After the film released in 2003, it was very well received, becoming the most popular film in South Korea for the year. Over 5 million people watched it in theaters, and it became the fourth most watched movie of all time in the country. As time went on, people appreciated its greatness all across the world, and it is regarded as one of the best true crime films ever made. It did its job at being compelling, thrilling, and entertaining. But more importantly, it reignited interest in the case. And 2 decades later, that case finally became solved. In 2019, a man who was already convicted for the assault and murder of his sister-in-law became a suspect in the HWASEONG murders. After testing the DNA from one of the victims with the new technology they now had, they finally found a match. Lee Chun-jae was already serving a life in prison sentence for the murder of his sister-in-law in 1994, which is also around the time the HWASEONG murders ended. This being an obvious connection made and with irrefutable DNA evidence, on September 18, 2019, he was announced as a suspect in the serial murders. At first he denied involvement, but less than a month later, he admitted to the 10 murders along with 4 others between 1991 and 1994 when he was eventually caught, and many other terrible crimes. He expressed no remorse or empathy and was surprised cops didn't catch him sooner. Because he couldn't be convicted for the murders and seemed to have a sense of pride and accomplishment, he willingly confessed to being the HWASEONG killer. As horrible as this just piece of garbage is, at the very least South Koreans had a sense of relief knowing he was going to be in jail for life, and the killer had finally been identified. Yoon Sung-yeol was finally set free after being wrongfully imprisoned for almost 20 years. I guess there's at least that silver lining, but after researching this Lee Chun-jae monster, I'm just pissed, man. He was actually born in HWASEONG, and after serving in the military and being discharged, he took out his frustration with sex crimes because he hated the monotony of not being in the military. He also said he hadn't felt a sense of achievement since he left until his first murder. But the crazy part about Memories of Murder is the final main suspect is eerily similar to Lee Chun-jae. Both were in the military and went to work construction jobs after. Obviously their characteristics would be the same because of the descriptions Bong Joon-ho based him off of, but remember, he said he wasn't even sure if that was the killer in his own movie, when in reality, he got it very right. When you watch the movie after knowing the real case, this guy feels like an extremely accurate representation of Lee Chun-jae. Now the question is, does this take away from the ending of the movie, which I argued is more effective and better with an ambiguous ending? Personally, I don't think so. Lee Chun-jae wouldn't have been able to watch it because he was already in prison, but that doesn't change the fear of not knowing who the killer was. Up until 2019, everything stays the same. But now there is a satisfaction of knowing the real killer is being punished in some capacity. If you haven't seen the movie until after watching this video or hearing about the case somewhere else, yes, it may change it for you. But that's why Memories of Murder is one of the best. It's its own amazing piece of work with beautiful cinematography, fantastic writing and acting, and executes the mystery and horror perfectly. But it had a purpose. It changed the idea of what kind of effect a movie could have, and it did it earnestly. Who knows if the case gets solved if the movie was never made or it didn't reach as many people. Bong Joon-ho set out to create a conversation, and in turn created a masterpiece. The movie can be watched in multiple ways from different perspectives. You can watch it as a standalone. You can watch it after researching the case. You can watch it from the mind of the detectives, the killer, or the people of HWASEONG. It's timeless.